I wanted to do these episodes in one take, but it looks like I've been getting a lot of call-ins, and the call-ins are specific to the RPG A Day 2021 podcast that I'm putting out. So I'm going to be including call-ins based on these podcasts or referring to these podcasts, and then doing my one take. So I guess it's a change. We have to adapt. And here we go.
Carl, dude, thanks for all the love on your trust episode, man. That was awesome. That was super nice to hear. And yeah, the question of when did trust in science begin to erode, that's a tricky one, man. I don't know. The thing I hear a lot these days is anytime science updates or changes something, everyone assumes that science is wrong. But that's, as you pointed out, that's how science works. You come up with a hypothesis, you test it. If things seem to be working in that way, you think that way is right until something else comes along to show you that you're not right. I think part of the reluctance, like my reluctance with a lot of archaeological science, is that they seem to be stuck in the mud and they don't seem to want to take count of new evidence. I think we've reached a new era in science where in certain cases you don't have to be a quote unquote scientist to perform good science, and folks are now able to get that information out there. And I think that ruffles the feathers of a lot of folks in the upper echelons of science, that they don't necessarily like losing that position of authority. So I think that's where some of it comes from. But yeah, like I only feel that way about, mainstream history and science. When it comes to shit like biology and physics and all that stuff, I'm right there. I've read enough books that I feel good about my own knowledge on those subjects. And I think that's part of the problem. I think that people are getting stupider. There is a lot more misinformation out there, and it's much easier to access, that folks see this misinformation, don't want to do any of their own research, just listen to what somebody tells them, because that's much easier. And so, yeah, you start to distrust science because you're a dumbass and don't want to study for yourself. Those people, like, you can't believe everything you read, and then you ask them where they're getting their information from, and they say Facebook. And it's just like, okay, there's no point in talking to you. Yeah, so that was really cool. I love that. I also really like that you talked about trusting the game designers. That was an interesting take. I didn't think about that. Yeah, I trust Paizo to put out a good first book to an adventure path. I'm not sure about the later books. Like, of all the Paizo adventure paths I've played so far, which has been Rise of the Rune Lords, Wrath of the Righteous, Carrion Crown. There's probably one or two more in there. I've really enjoyed the first book, but not always the later books. I was really disappointed with the later books of Carrion Crown, for instance. But I do like the fact, and I think I heard it on your show first, that Paizo is going down to a slimmer model for their adventure pass, going down to just 3 books. And that's a really good idea, because that lets the DM play around in the world more instead of just following the rails. Because otherwise, with those 6-book adventure pass, they just take so damn long. You can't really add anything else. Anyway, man, great stuff. Peace out.
Hey, Joe, thanks for the call. And this is why I save these takes and responses to trust until today, which is think. And think, that's what you suggest, is that we need to think more for ourselves, evaluate what we see, and make better decisions in general. So thank you for those comments. And yeah, I'll add to that because I'm commenting on your responses and about Paizo adventure paths. I wonder what happens. I mean, I know they have different authors for different books, and I feel like in some of the early adventure paths, they maybe had they'd all meet together and come up with a cohesive story. And I don't know if how consistently that happens now, or if that depends on the adventure path editor in chief, if that happens and how much they try to make a cohesive story. But there are some that just like, whoa, where did that come from? And others like, oh, this kind of flows really well. I would say that, for example, the adventure path that I finished, Dead Sons for Starfinder, it worked really well, and it gave you, it started you small in and around Absalom and expanded out into the solar system of the pack worlds, and then it got you, into a couple locations in the pack worlds, and then it got you out into the vast. So it was really done well to expand, give a great overview of Starfinder, and present a really good, cool story with multiple bad guys and multiple ways to even take down the bad guys. So and it worked, right? We finished it. It seemed there was no dead book. All the books were exciting in their own right. So that looks like an example of where there was a cohesive planned story. Whereas other adventure paths, and I can't think of any. I know the one, maybe with Serpent Skull, which is not the best adventure path I've heard, where it starts out really cool. You're shipwrecked on an island. You got to figure a way off, and then who knows where it goes. And then I would say the Shackles one, the one with your pirates. The first 3 books are really cool. You mutiny on a boat, and then you try to become a pirate, make a living, and then you run the big race to get yourself the charter, and then, I don't know, it kind of goes in a different direction. And players lose focus because of that. So there you go. That's, I guess, my take on a couple there. I'm sure there are more examples of that. But better to have a unified, cohesive story. I would say like Rise of the Rune Lords, Curse of the Crimson Throne are pretty contained. Even the one that I mentioned, the first one, Council of Thieves, is self-contained. It takes place in one city with little dalliances out of the city, but it's all focused on that one city, and there's a cohesive plot. So there you go. Pretty cool stuff. So in summary, I think we enjoy adventure plots that have a cohesive overall story that is logical, whereas the ones we don't like seem to throw in, right, that episode in a TV series that you're watching that's just a filler. And we don't want filler. We don't have time for filler.
Hey, Carl, it's BJ. Another great episode on trust. I really liked your episode there. I got a couple comments that have absolutely nothing to do with they kind of do. One of them does. First of all, you said, when did people stop trusting science? I don't know how far back that goes. I know there is a quote from Isaac Asimov, pretty famous one from 1980, where he talked about the danger of anti-intellectualism that was already apparent in our society. I think it's along the lines of, there's this idea that your ignorance is as value as my knowledge. So at least by 1980, although I suspect if people were observing it in 1980, there were roots going back a little bit farther. Anyway, so as far as trusting scientists, that at least goes back to the 80s, so 40 plus years ago. And I share your frustration on that. I'm a social scientist by training, so even though it's a different subject matter, the same standards of proof, although we study things that are a little harder to pin down sometimes. But as far as statistical power and can you draw a valid conclusion given the evidence in front of you, that's still there. And so I share that frustration professionally, but I also know plenty of friends and relatives who are lay people who are also just appreciative of the value of science, who are frustrated with some people's willful disregard. Anyway, The other comment I wanted to make was just on my earlier call about the football players. Yeah, I think most of those guys are really wonderful guys. I didn't mean to imply that they were all just meathead jocks who used to bully nerdy kids. And I've actually had an opportunity a while back for a span of 4 or 5 years to run some camps for disadvantaged kids, and got to work with quite a few coaches and players who'd been at the NFL and the Division I college level. And if you think those guys are just kind of getting to play and goof off for a living, now they work hard, and a lot of them are very bright and very. They approach that profession like a professional, the same way most people you would hope approach their profession, whatever that profession might be, where they work hard and they take it seriously, but they still find the fun and enjoyment in what it is they do. So, yeah, but again, another great episode on trust.
Hey, BJ, thanks so much for the calls and comments, and I really enjoy when you call in because you add some data, really, to what you're talking about, and so far it's been in support of what I've said, so that's good. But hey, even if it's not in support, I always appreciate a good discussion, and I like that you're bringing in not just some facts or quotes that you've read, but also some of your own personal experiences that we can talk about and discuss about RPGs and life and cerebral topics like trust and the like. So thanks a lot again. And hey, we got like Joe said, we're about a third of the way done, so let's keep it up. And it's been a really good run so far with RPG a Day 2021. Do players like to think? Does thinking in a game preclude the drinking of beer and the eating of pretzels? What is the origin of think and thought in D&D specifically, or in other games, when it comes to tricks and traps and puzzles? Right, one of the most famous adventures in AD&D is the Tomb of Horrors, which is short on monsters but full of traps and puzzles. And the philosophy, I believe, at the time was for players to think through those puzzles. And if you made the wrong decision, there's no roll. You couldn't roll your intelligence or roll your perception or notice or awareness or disable traps necessarily unless you found or solved the puzzle and the trick. So I like that as a GM. I think it's a great challenge to present them and to try to solve them as a player. I would also say that one of the most popular dungeon adventures was the Mud Sorcerer's Tomb, which was created way back in AD&D in the pages of Dungeon, but then redone for 3.5 for 4E, and I think there is a 5E hack of it too somewhere. So these dungeons, look at another popular one, the Hidden Shrine of Tamachuan, right? That one's been redone several times, and that was puzzles and tricks and traps. I would say White Plume Mountain, same thing. Adversaries, yes, and big boss at the end, yes, but tricks and traps throughout for the most part. So pretty interesting, right? Some classic tales or dungeon crawls are full of puzzles and tricks and traps, and even the newer ones made for 3.5 like Rapanathuk and these mega dungeons, they don't just have monsters in every room, they have puzzles and tricks and traps to solve. So my experience, really, there are players who get into that and love it and listen to the riddle and write down the riddle, and there are other players who just would rather not, and they let everyone else engage, but they do not. So is that good or bad for the hobby? I don't know. I mean, do you, as a GM, say let players just talk amongst themselves and go for it, or do you as a GM say, well, your player's not that intelligent, so they would never be able to come up with? Or do you just run it? So nowadays in the modern, I think 4E and 5E have skill challenges where you can just have them, or even 3.5, right? 3.5 codifies everything. When I say 3.5, I also mean Pathfinder at times. They codify everything. So then do you let the players just solve the riddle or the trick or the trap, or let them roll to see if their character can solve the trick or the trap or the riddle, right? So how does that work? I mean, if for like in a riddle, if the players don't know it, although generally there's some pretty standard riddles, it seems, in our hobby, right? They take them from the ones from the Lord of the Rings or classic myth. So do you let the players just solve them, or do you let them roll something so you can give them a hint? It's very curious. I mean, I don't know. I'll say in my experience with this, actually, in a way, it ties back in a way to Wilderness, right? So one of the newer offerings from Wizard of the Coast is the Tomb of Annihilation. And it has like a chance early on, if you don't run the mega story, you don't necessarily have to run the overarching story, but you could actually start it at first level and be it a city crawl very early on, maybe excursions, slight excursions out into the few hexes around the main city of Port Nyazarmu or something like that. When you get into the little higher levels, maybe after third levels, when the players have their archetype and more staying power, they explore the wilderness. Eventually, the clues lead them to this lost city, and then they have this sort of lost city ruin crawl that culminates in destroying a fane of powerful snake creatures. So, and that seemed to work really well for my group. They really enjoyed all the aspects, from the city to the wilderness to finding the lost city to defeating the big bad of the lost city. And then the campaign kind of changes, right? You find this legendary Tomb of Annihilation, and inside it's tricks and traps. And there is where I lost the players. They just did not like wandering around the dungeon and not fighting things, but having to solve puzzles. And again, a couple players, I would say, got into it. It varied from time to time which players got into it. I think some players like solving traps, maybe because it's more mechanical and you roll dice to figure out traps. Some like just listening to the riddle or hearing the situation and go, okay, here's the solution, instead of rolling the dice, which I think is the coolest way. And other players just detach. And I guess that campaign faded because one of the players was killed by a trap, and we stopped playing. I guess the players got tired of it in general. So maybe this leads to maybe a thought, and I could be wrong. This is my opinion based on an anecdotal observation, Joe Richter, not mounds of data. But maybe modern players and modern sensibilities don't like this problem-solving puzzles. I'd rather roll dice to solve it. I'd rather kick down doors, beat shit up, and take their stuff. Which maybe goes back to even old school sensibilities. Were those games fun for people at conventions, or were they just a slog? I had the chance to play the Tomb of Horrors in a convention game, and we literally just got through the first hallway. It did take a while, and that type of game does take some time because you need to be methodical. You don't want to get blown up. I'd read it, but it had been so long, I didn't know all the nuances, and I did not remember all the problems and traps in that first hall at all. So we had to go through this methodically with our characters, and even at the beginning, which passageway do you go through when you get to the tomb, right? So it's challenging, but for me, ultimately, it's fun. Maybe I'm a bit more cerebral as a GM and as a player, and when given the chance, I will sit down and try to think through these riddles and puzzles, and sometimes I won't get them or get them wrong. But other times it's kind of neat. So anyway, think. How do you think? How does your player think? Do you like puzzles or not? And that's my thoughts for RPG A Day 2021 with the prompt word think.